The hum of the airplane's engines was a constant, soothing backdrop to the bustling conversations and muffled sounds of flight attendants moving through the aisles. It was a typical flight, filled with tired travelers eager to get to their destinations. The woman seated by the window was no different. She was well-dressed, her sunglasses resting on her head, flipping through a fashion magazine as if she owned the world. But in the seat next to her, a man was quietly reading a book. His dark suit was perfectly tailored, his posture calm but commanding. Elijah Grant, a well-known businessman and philanthropist, had always preferred to keep to himself. He enjoyed the peace of air travel, away from the eyes of the public, even though his face was recognizable to anyone who followed business news. That peace, however, would be shattered the moment the woman spoke. "Excuse me," she said loudly, her voice cutting through the quiet hum of the cabin. "Can you move? I can't sit next to someone like you." Elijah blinked in surprise, unsure whether he had heard her correctly. But there was no mistaking it. The woman was looking at him with disgust, her lips curled in a sneer. She glanced around the cabin, drawing the attention of nearby passengers. But no one spoke. No one intervened. Elijah, however, stayed calm. He'd seen this before. He knew the look, the assumption that came with it. But unlike others who might have reacted in anger or fear, Elijah was different. He had learned the power of remaining composed in the face of ignorance. "I beg your pardon?" Elijah said softly, his tone even, but his eyes locked onto hers. The woman's face reddened, clearly expecting him to back down, to cower before her. "I said," she repeated, her voice rising with a hint of arrogance, "I can't sit next to you. I demand a new seat." Flight attendants, who had been walking down the aisle, paused for a moment, sensing the tension. One of them looked at the woman, then at Elijah, unsure of how to proceed. "I'll speak to the crew," the woman insisted. "I can't be in the same row as, well, him." Elijah took a slow breath. The hum of the airplane seemed to fade as his thoughts collected, and in that moment, he felt a quiet resolve. He had dealt with racism in many forms, subtle, overt, and even institutional. But he wasn't going to let this woman's ignorance go unchallenged. "I think you've made your point," Elijah said, standing up with a calm that only made the woman more agitated. "But I have to tell you, ma'am, you're very mistaken about who I am." The woman stared at him, clearly thinking that he was just trying to brush her off. "Oh, I'm sure you're just another one of those people," she said, dismissing him with a wave of her hand. "Trying to act like you belong here." Elijah's expression hardened, but his voice remained steady. "No," he said, "I don't just belong here. I own half of this airline's largest competitor. I'm Elijah Grant. I don't need to prove myself to anyone, but perhaps you should be careful who you insult." The woman's face went pale. The magazine she had been holding slipped from her fingers and fell to the floor. Her arrogance faltered as the realization of who she was speaking to hit her like a freight train. I didn't," she stammered, her confidence melting into visible panic. Elijah looked around the cabin. The passengers had been listening. Some were quietly recording, others were whispering. He knew this would be the moment when the entire flight, the entire world, would turn its gaze on this woman's ignorance. "Yes," Elijah said with a subtle smile. "You didn't know who you were dealing with, but I think that's the problem." The flight attendant, now fully aware of the situation, stepped forward, offering a polite apology. "Sir, ma'am, we're moving you to a different seat." The woman didn't say anything. Her eyes were wide, but she didn't protest. She had no words left. As Elijah settled into his new seat, he didn't look back. The truth had been revealed, and with it, the power of silence in the face of ignorance. As the plane cruised through the sky, Elijah leaned back in his seat, his eyes closed, reflecting on what had just transpired. He had long since learned that the true power of such situations was not in the confrontation itself, but in how you handled it afterward. He knew he had made his point, but there was no sense in making a spectacle out of the woman's humiliation. She had exposed herself for what she truly was, and that was enough. But in the cabin, the tension lingered. The other passengers were still watching, the whispers still passing from seat to seat. Some looked ashamed. Others looked fascinated, unsure of how to process what had just happened. The woman, now seated in the aisle across from Elijah, remained silent, her eyes cast downward. She didn't dare look at him, but Elijah could feel the weight of her regret hanging in the air. He didn't feel satisfaction, nor was he interested in watching her squirm. What mattered now was the bigger picture, the moment when people saw the impact of her actions and the power of standing up for what was right. The flight attendants moved past them, offering beverages, their faces still tight with the discomfort of the earlier scene. They couldn't avoid the reality of it, but at least they had been trained to handle moments like this without taking sides. The plane began its descent into their destination, and as the seatbelt sign illuminated, Elijah's phone buzzed. It was a message from his assistant, Monica. "Elijah, the video's already gone viral. News outlets are reaching out for statements. Do you want to make a public statement about what happened?" He smiled, knowing the inevitable had come. It was only a matter of time before the story spread, but he wasn't going to use the opportunity to garner attention for himself. Instead, his response would be simple and clear. His words would carry the weight of a man who had seen enough injustice to recognize when to act, and when to let silence speak for him. "No statement," he typed back. "I want the story to be about the action, not the person. Let it be a lesson." As the plane landed, the woman quickly gathered her things and rushed off the plane, clearly eager to escape the spotlight. Elijah, however, was in no hurry. He walked down the jet bridge with his head held high, his pace steady and unhurried. The moment had passed, and now it was about letting the world take its course. By the time he stepped into the terminal, the story had already spread across social media. People were tweeting, commenting, and sharing their thoughts. Some praised Elijah for his calm and collected demeanor. Others condemned the woman for her prejudiced behavior. But one thing was clear. The conversation had shifted. At the baggage claim, Elijah overheard a conversation between two women, clearly discussing what had happened. "I can't believe she did that," one said, shaking her head. "He was so calm. I would have lost it." The other woman nodded. "I don't know how he kept it together, but it's nice to see someone standing up like that." Elijah didn't need to look to know they were talking about him. He wasn't interested in the praise. It was never about him. It was about making people see the truth and recognize the impact of their actions. The plane incident would fade in time, but the lesson would linger long after. The next morning, the woman's life had already started to unravel. Her name, now circulating widely across social media, was met with a deluge of comments, mostly negative. News outlets had already picked up the story, and her actions were being dissected on television programs and online platforms. For her, the realization was hitting hard. She had made a mistake, one that could not be undone. Her privilege had allowed her to act with such disregard for Elijah, but now it was her turn to face the consequences. Her boss had already called her, requesting an urgent meeting. Her phone had been flooded with messages, some asking for interviews, others offering their sympathies. But it was the messages from people she knew personally that stung the most. Friends who had once looked up to her were now questioning her actions, and some had even distanced themselves. Elijah, on the other hand, had received an outpouring of support. From the moment the video of the confrontation hit social media, messages of praise flooded in. People admired his composure and his ability to stand firm in the face of blatant discrimination. What was more powerful, though, was the broader conversation his actions had sparked, one that called for a reevaluation of the assumptions and prejudices people held. especially in spaces where wealth and power often overshadowed basic human decency. Elijah didn't seek the spotlight. He never intended for his actions to go viral. But he knew that sometimes the right thing to do wasn't about personal gain. It was about setting an example for others. By taking a stand, he had shown that it was possible to expose injustice without retaliating with anger. Days later, the woman issued a public apology. She admitted her fault, but the damage was done. Her reputation had been permanently altered. What should have been a moment of reflection on her own biases had turned into a public spectacle, reminding people of how often unchecked privilege could lead to cruelty. Elijah never responded to her apology. He didn't need to. His silence, just like his actions, had already spoken louder than any words ever could.